In the quaint yet mysterious town of Fell Village, known colloquially as Wolf Mountain, life hums along at a leisurely pace, concealing a secret beneath its idyllic surface. Nearly all its inhabitants are werewolves. Benjamin James, or Ben, works at the town's soul store, a hub that sells everything from groceries to electronics, making it a peculiar blend of supermarket and general store. The shop doubles as a local landmark, forever tied to a significant event from a decade prior, one Ben was deeply involved in. Ben's mundane routine is disrupted when he unexpectedly reunites with Alexandra, or Allie, a woman from his past, after a chance encounter at a club. Their reunion reignites a long-extinguished spark, reminding Ben of their youthful love. Despite the complications that arise from Allie's role working for her domineering father and Ben's efforts to reintegrate into Fell's community, they spend a passionate night together, rediscovering their connection. Allie, burdened by her father's demands and an impending arranged marriage, finds solace in her friendship with Naomi, who encourages her to break free from familial pressures. In a daring move, Allie decides to quit her job, abandon her responsibilities within the werewolf pack, and her family, opting for a life on her own terms. Naomi, a fierce and loyal friend, supports Allie throughout her rebellion, offering a shoulder to lean on and a hefty dose of tequila-fueled distraction. Meanwhile, Ben, struggling with the aftermath of their night together, and the complexities of their rekindled relationship, tries to find balance in his newfound purpose within the pack under Rex's guidance. As the story unfolds, Ben and Allie navigate the treacherous waters of love and loyalty, torn between their desires and the constraints of their werewolf society. Nicholas, the alpha, enters the fray, symbolizing the weight of tradition and authority looming over Allie's decision to forge her own path. The novel culminates in a tense standoff, as Allie contemplates escape while Ben grapples with his feelings and responsibilities. Shadows of Wolf Mountain is a tale of love, liberation, and the intricate dance between individual freedom and the expectations of a tightly knit, supernaturally charged community. It explores themes of identity, sacrifice, and the enduring power of connection in the face of overwhelming odds. Chapter 1. Friday afternoons in Fell Village, also known as Wolf Mountain, weren't exciting by any stretch of the imagination. The only thing missing was the creaking of crickets, but this near the forest and this deep into summer. There were just leaves rustling in the wind, and the odd car passing by. Was a small town, close-knit, the kind of town romantic movies were made in. But also the kind of town that horror movies were made in. At least Benjamin James liked to think so. He watched the day go by outside the window as the only customer who had been in all day slowly wandered her way around the store's aisles. Not that many people worked in Fell. Most of them either lived on farms or went into the bigger cities to work before coming back. In the mornings, the cars would drive out of town in convoy, either to nearby New York City or one of the other towns around Fell. Kids would take the bus to the big school in the next town, and everyone else would settle in for a day of trashy television and spy on their neighbors through lace curtains. Remarkably normal, all told, especially for a town made up almost entirely of werewolves. Home sweet home, Ben thought as he saw two women with strollers walk by the store, pointing and whispering furiously to each other. The store had become something of a town landmark starting about 10 years ago. People pointed and stared and gossiped when they passed by. Ben had long since come to terms with the fact that things were never forgotten in Fell, and he'd been part of the biggest event to hit Fell in about 50 years. Still, it was kind of hard to shrug off. People tended to be mean even 10 years on. In any case, being the only store in town had its advantages. The store was a cross between a supermarket and a general store, selling anything from phone chargers to cake mix and everything in between. Ben had worked there for years, ever since he was in high school. Then came the incident, as his father referred to it. He was the first to admit that it had been a huge mistake. Even if gossiping about Ben and his family was practically the town's favorite pastime, people couldn't exactly avoid him. Working at the store made for busy evenings and weekends, but most of the people left after the morning exodus weren't exactly the cream of the conversational crop. Case in point was the old woman currently doddering her way through the store, peering curiously at everything from about an inch away. Luckily, the store was empty except for her, so she had the run of the aisles. Ben leaned forward on the counter. So far she'd asked for brown sugar, bunch of spices and disposable roasting pans, each of which he'd had to find and put in her basket for her. And it looked like she was about to remember something else on her list. He was right. Do you have whole wheat flour? The old woman croaked. Ben looked down at her from the raised step behind the counter. The store was quiet even for a weekday afternoon. He sighed deeply and made his way around to retrieve the flour from the shelf she was looking so intently at. Anything else, ma'am? No, thank you, she said as she shuffled towards the till, of course, leaving her basket of things on the floor behind her. Ben picked it up, stifled the huff he felt coming, and walked to the till to check her out. Her hands trembled a little as she carefully took money out of her little purse and handed it over. Thank you, young man, she croaked. Very kind. She peered at him through Coke bottle glasses. You look familiar, she said. Yeah, he replied, heaving her bags off the counter to carry them out the door. I've been working here for a long time, Mrs. Beecham. You see me every week. Oh yes, she said. I remember. I know the owners, Mr. and Mrs. James. Lovely people. Didn't they have a son that ran away to those awful wolves in the next village? Yes, they did, he said. That was me. There it was. She stiffened up, noticeably, even on her geriatric frame. Was still something of a legend in Fell. Elephants had nothing on werewolves. When it came to remembering. He ignored the woman's look of disdain, held the door open for her to shuffle through, as he hauled her bags to her equally old car. She climbed in as coolly as she could manage, trying not to even look at him when he put the bags in her back seat for her. He smirked to himself. 10 years on, and the old people still insisted on making him suffer for his mistake. He smiled widely for her benefit and took pleasure in her look of slight confusion. Well, I hope you have a great day, ma'am, he said, trying to suppress the growl that rose in his throat. His family insisted on simply calling it the incident. He had been 18 years old, made a stupid mistake, and tried to fix it as soon as he knew how. But people still talked about it in hushed tones now instead of the open disgust that they used to. The thought that the son of one of the town pillars, one of the oldest families, would try to join a rival pack had been unconscionable. Couldn't happen in a place like this, they thought, not in a lovely town like Fell. No one wanted for anything, at least not enough to betray their bloodline. Something must be wrong with that boy, they said. The old woman scowled and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving it completely empty. Back to normal. Back to the normal weekday monotony. On the worst days, it felt like his brain was slowly being suffocated in a blanket. In those moments when he was completely honest with himself, he could admit that life didn't have much color anymore. It wasn't new to him. People were always more than willing to express their disapproval of something he'd done as a teenager, but it did wear on the soul. 10 years seemed like an eternity looking back on it now. The village had been in turmoil. The new pack alpha, Rex Blake, had just taken over from his father, and he had no idea what he was doing. Everyone was tense and watchful. Between that and the almost constant fights with his father about everything, really, Ben was overwhelmed. He remembered that day like it was yesterday. Ivan Volkov, the late alpha of the Sanguine pack, had been prowling around the woods, which had long been neutral ground between the two villages. And Ben let himself get suckered into a mistake. One that lasted about 3 months before he finally came home. When he came back, he had to start all over, rebuilding friendships with people willing to rebuild them, trying to work through his mother's tears. Every time she saw him, the hateful stares from neighbors. It still hadn't really gone back to the way it was. Life would have been a lot different if he hadn't decided to run that night. Slowly but surely, life managed to get back some semblance of normalcy. The years passed. Ben caught up on the classes he'd missed at school as easily as he ever had, then graduated, but he was still a pariah in town. People had long memories in a town like this. His father more than most. The night Ben had come home from Sanguine, his father just looked him up and down and said, "You really screwed the pooch on this one, didn't you, boy?" Ben held his tongue. Ron was a large man, with snow-white hair and a smooth, ruddy face, who had taught his son from an early age not to talk back. It had taken nearly 3 months for Ron to actually acknowledge Ben's attempts at an apology, and another 4 for them to start talking to each other every day. Still, it wasn't the same. But he knew the problem wasn't his family or the neighbors or the people who gossiped about him in the store. Something had changed in the 3 months he'd spent away. He wasn't the same person he used to be or the same person he would have been A part of him hadn't come back from Sanguine, he knew that. Now. So 10 years went by with Ben just going through the motions. He took some management classes at the college 2 towns over in between shifts at the store, built up enough credits for a degree in business. He worked at the store, went home to his little apartment at the edge of the village, went out for a drink every few days, found someone from outside fell to keep him company for the night, and did it all again the next day. He was a good-looking man. He never really lacked for female company. At least sex helped him sleep. There was only so much alcohol he could drink without risking alcohol poisoning, but a new friend each night was a pretty effective sleeping pill. Life had become pretty routine in the last few years. Taking over running the store was the only significant thing that had happened since he came home. He remembered it, clear as a bell, even 5 years on. Ronnie can't keep going like this, his mother said one afternoon, shortly after his father's 58th birthday. I know, Ben admitted, but there's not a lot I can do about it. He barely even talks to me. They were in the kitchen, his mother sitting at the table with a glass of iced tea in front of her. Summer was in full swing. The house was bright and cool, the air conditioning unit humming gently. Ben stood by the counter and watched her out of the corner of his eye. Dolores James was a small woman, always had been, but time, stress, and her husband had diminished her so much that Ben didn't know if it was because he remembered her as bigger than she was, or because she was actually smaller now. His father was her complete opposite, with a temper to match, and he was never shy about showing it frequently. Ben knew that better than anyone. Ron had had a heart attack a month before, but he insisted on coming into work every day as usual. A small episode isn't going to stop me from running my business, he said, seeing as he was still in a hospital bed at the time. Ben had his doubts. What do you want me to do about it anyway? He asked. They just come back from visiting Ron at the hospital. Dolores looked strained. The ever-present bags under her eyes were darker than usual. I don't know, Benny. Isn't there a way you could take up some of the slack at the store? Mom, there isn't any more slack to take. I'm already doing all the purchasing and the payroll and helping the customers and helping the stock. Boy, I don't know what else I can do. It was true. Ben had taken up all the duties at the store that his father would allow him to, but actually managing the store? That was still Ron's purview, and he wasn't in a rush to give it up. Ben knew his father very well. He wouldn't accept help for any other reason other than a complete inability to stand up on his own anymore, and even then it would be a problem. It took almost 6 months to convince Ron to hand over the reins of his beloved store. Ben would finally make the changes that his father had resisted. Over the years, he put in an ATM, started stocking electronics that were manufactured after the year 2000, and started accepting credit cards about 20 years later than they should have. It wasn't a bad life all told, no matter how boring it got. It was nice to have something that he could call his own. Once the papers were signed, not even his father could take it from him. But still, in the quiet moments, Ben's mind inevitably wandered to the what if. What if he had never left? What if he hadn't come back? What if he had stuck it out in Sanguine? He went back into the store, brushed a non-existent speck of dirt off the counter, straightened a display of cans that didn't need straightening, and then headed to the back of the store. In the style of countless small-town general stores, his father had installed a bell above the door to signal when customers were coming. A few years ago, when he refurbished the store, Ben had upgraded it to an electronic one so the bing-bong sound would be audible, even if he wasn't sitting at the counter all day. At least today he wasn't alone. Tyler, the spotty-faced teenager who served as a stock boy and cart wrangler at the store, was sweeping something up in the back, obliviously plugged into his headphones. Ben felt sorry for him. 16 was not a good age for anyone, and poor Tyler seemed to have gotten the worst of the acne and the awkwardness. He waved at Tyler to get his attention and pointed at the back office. Tyler nodded, his hair flopping in front of his face, and Ben stifled a little hint of irritation. The kid was completely clueless. It was hard to imagine himself as that young. He settled himself at his desk and shifted around some papers. At least it's sundress season, he thought to himself. He could probably find someone in a short dress to keep him company tonight. It would be something to look forward to. He booted up his laptop and opened his email. Receipts, spam and messages. From suppliers. Nothing to get excited about. He was sorting the emails into the folders he had created for them when he came across a message that he hadn't been expecting. The subject line simply read, "Hi," but it was the name next to it that made his heart skip. Allie. He hesitated before opening the message. Allie. It had been so long since she sent him a message. Their correspondence had been sporadic at best over the past 5 years, which surprised and dismayed him. Anytime he actually stopped to think about it. The last message she'd sent him was almost a month ago. She'd sent him a cheerful text asking how he was, and why he wasn't replying to her messages anymore. It wasn't a question that he could answer with any level of honesty, not if he wanted to preserve the friendship they'd managed to build. Allie had been the best part of the 3 months he spent in Sanguine. The daughter of one of the leading families of the werewolf pack, she'd been the first one to notice him lurking around the village limits. She brought him to her house, snuck him inside, given him some food and clean clothes before she took him to see Ivan. Even through the torture of the time he'd spent trying to prove his worth to the psychopathic alpha, Allie had been a ray of sunshine for him. Her father didn't approve of him, of course, and they'd had to do their fair share of sneaking around, but Allie had quickly become the most important part of his life. When he decided to go back home, Allie was devastated. She'd understood why, because she was wonderful. They'd kept in touch over the last 10 years, frequently at first, but then life got in the way, and now they barely exchanged 2 messages a week. Ben opened the email. "Hey Benny," she wrote. "It's been so long. I sent you a message the other week, but you didn't answer, so I thought I'd write you an email. Just wanted to say hey. I miss you." He smiled to himself. Allie had always been a positive person. Even when he didn't reply to her messages, she kept sending them, kept trying to tease him out of his shell with stupid puns and jokes. For 10 years they'd been sending texts and emails, and then after that tweets, Snapchats, everything. Technology had made it so easy for people to keep in touch, but it also made her hard to forget. Not that he wanted to when he was truly honest with himself, but having 10 years worth of messages and emails stocked up wasn't helping him get over her. The night he left Sanguine to go home to Fell was one of those times he knew he wouldn't forget for the rest of his life. It was like a dream remembered in bright flashes instead of altogether. Ivan's pack was in complete turmoil, still reeling from the news that he had died in a showdown with Rex. Ben knew that he couldn't stay anymore. Outsiders were not welcomed easily in wolf packs at the best of times, but the fact that people knew Ben was from Rex's pack made his position even more precarious. The minute he heard the news about Ivan, he knew he would have to go before they turned on him. Allie's father, a scarily cold man named Allie Galkin, was the head of the anti-Ben James committee, and life would just get more dangerous. The village elders were in the middle of a crisis meeting, Andre included, so Ben took his chance and texted Allie to meet him in the forest that bordered Fell and Sanguine. Her father would never have allowed her to leave if he had known, and if God forbid he had seen the texts, Allie's world would become a living hell. They met by a tree at the edge of the village to say their goodbyes. She burst into tears the moment she saw him, and he ran to comfort her. They held each other for a long time. Looking back on it now, he could see how young they had been, how completely lost, helpless, and in love. But at that moment there was only the two of them, not her father or his or the 2 packs. He just held her and stroked her back and her hair and tried to memorize every detail he possibly could. "Please don't forget me when you go home," she sobbed. He couldn't think of anything to say to that, just made the generic shushing and comforting noises until she settled down a little. Everything after that was mostly a blur. He remembered the feel of her vintage t-shirt on his arm as he held her, and the way her hair smelled like her flowery shampoo, and how her tears felt cold on his hand in the fall chill. She asked him not to go, then to take her with him, but then it all blurred together. She was always the one to make the first move. She managed to work her way past the walls he'd put up and into his heart, and leaving her had almost broken him. He hadn't been able to sleep for the first 2 weeks when he came home. Instead, he waited for every text and every email with his heart in his throat. By the time she'd gone to college, he had managed to cut down the number of messages every day. He told himself he was doing it for her sake, to help her move on, But he knew that it wasn't the truth. It was all about him. He braced himself to compose an answer. Hey yourself, he wrote. I'm so sorry I disappeared. Work has been crazy. How are you? Too generic? Too vague? Was that what someone even said to a person who had been their best friend? He deleted the whole message. Hey Allie, he wrote. I'm so glad you wrote. I've been thinking about you. Not a lie. I'm so happy to hear from you. It's been so long. I missed you so much too. Sounded good. Least it didn't sound as desperate as he felt. Somehow it didn't seem like enough, but he didn't know what else to say. He hit send and waited for a second. He felt like a nervous kid again. She had this effect on him. He would let himself fall out of the pattern of their correspondence, get out of the habit of talking to her every day, and then every message of hers would be like the first time and give him butterflies. It was a terrible pattern. Luckily it had a surefire cure: booze. And he didn't have much of that on hand at the office. He waited for a few minutes, keeping an eye on his inbox to see if she would reply. I'm so pathetic, he chuckled to himself. He pushed his laptop aside and picked up his phone. Friday afternoons might be boring, but Friday nights were anything but. The one bar in town, the Fourth Horseman, had been established back in the 18th century when the town had been, but it was mostly the territory of bored old men. Ben spent his fair share of time there, of course, not something he was proud of. But Friday nights were when the clubs in the city would start to heat up. Looking for someone to warm his bed was much easier when he was surrounded by hordes of drunk girls out on the town with their friends. As if right on cue, his phone buzzed. Good old Pete. He always knew just when to call. Pete was one of a handful of people who actually treated Ben like a normal person instead of a leper. The two of them had grown up together, gone through scraped knees and parental disagreements together. When Ben came back, Pete picked up their friendship exactly where they left off, and in the years since had become Ben's closest confidant. Ben answered. He had barely said hello when Pete yelled a greeting into his ear. Hey man, said Pete. You coming out tonight? Ben looked at his computer screen and the 0 new messages waiting in his inbox. Yeah, sure, he replied. Where were you thinking of going? Same place as usual, man, Pete replied. No reason to mess with the winning formula. Ben laughed. Okay, man. Pick me up later, I don't want to take my car. Pete cheered. Yes. I knew it. You're planning to actually be fun tonight. Makes a change from you sitting around your house and moping. Listen, Pete, firstly I don't mope, and secondly we go out every week. You're not allowed to say exactly the same thing every single week. Shut up, man. I'll be at your place at 10. Just be ready, Pete said and ended the call. Ben checked his watch. The store closed at 9. He would have plenty of time to get to his apartment, shower and go. He checked his email one more time. She hadn't replied. He found himself feeling strangely disappointed and at the same time angry at himself. She had been his first love, sure, and having someone who understood what he went through was nice, but there was no reason that she should have this much of an effect on him now. Still, he got up and went out to find something to restock. Physical work would make him feel better, and then tonight he could find some other kind of distraction. He checked his phone again as he walked to the storeroom. No new messages. Okay, Ben, no more, he said aloud. No more. Just go to work. Ben didn't go back into the office until the store closed. On a Friday night, most people came in to buy wine for their weekend dinner parties or junk food. Teenagers hung around the beer and liquor displays looking around longingly for some sympathetic soul who would buy them beer for their parties. Luckily, most of the customers who came in didn't want to make a lot of conversation. They just got what they wanted, threw a few dirty looks his way, and then left. Tyler left him to do the closing, waving blankly at him as he left the store, plugged into his headphones, and finally Ben could go home. He went around and checked all the locks and the lights once, twice, and then once more. The store was his father's pride and joy. Just the thought of leaving something unlocked was a nightmare. He'd turned around on his drive home to check the locks more than once, but he didn't think he could face that tonight. Even his appointment with Pete was far from his mind now that he was heading home. All he could think about was getting home, getting some food, having a drink, and then going to sleep. Ben's house was not something out of a magazine by any means, but he took pride in keeping it up. It was clean and tidy at least, even if the rest of him didn't feel like that most of the time. Once his coat was hung up and his shoes put away, he got a beer out of the fridge and then settled on the couch. The silence in the house settled on him like fog. He didn't like to be alone, especially at night. Sleep didn't come easily to him, especially after what had happened in Sanguine Village. Nightmares of the things Ivan had put him through flashed through his mind, mingled with the normal surrealism of dreams. Allie was the main actor in many of them, sitting by her father and his father, taunting and laughing at him as he writhed on the ground in pain. Wakefulness was better than seeing that. He went through the numbers in his phone. Half the girls in there had already turned him down for lack of a commitment. He went through the rest of the numbers he might have a chance with, but he wasn't in the mood to see any of them. He finished his beer, flipping through the channels on the TV. It was the perfect white noise to try and relax after a long day. He was completely out of it when his phone started to buzz. He looked at it. Pete. He groaned. He'd completely forgotten that he was supposed to go out tonight. He flipped the phone over. Where are you? I'm outside. Pete's texts were always to the point, at least. Ben held his head in his hands and massaged his temples. Going out would be better than sitting at home. At least this way he could find someone new to spend the night with. He drained the rest of the beer and put his shoes on. He was a little too late though. Pete was getting ready to knock on the door, his fist raised in the air. Finally, he yelled. He pounded Ben on the shoulder instead. Let's go, man. Ladies are waiting for us. Pete was nothing if not a motivated friend. He'd pulled Ben out of funks time after time. Ben brushed Pete's hand off his shoulder. Stop yelling, man, he said. He closed the door behind him. Tonight I just want to drink and make no effort to talk to people at all. It was an instant change. As much as he'd wanted company before, the thought of having to make an effort to talk to someone he didn't already know was the worst thing in the world to him. You're disappointing me, Pete said. You'll probably change your mind again when we get there. Ben rolled his eyes at Pete and went out to Pete's car. The summer was starting to get hotter. The night was still not as muggy as it could have been, but the air was pleasant. As they drove through the empty streets, the prospect of a crowded club started to look better and better. He checked his phone again. Nothing from Allie. The club would at least help him take his mind off the emptiness in his inbox. Chapter 2. The meeting was taking so much longer than she thought it would. Allie started doodling in her notebook as her father went on and on, scrolling through charts and graphs on the projector. It was a necessary evil. She knew that better than anyone. The weekly staff meetings gave everyone a chance to catch up on what all their colleagues had been doing and to create a cohesive and friendly work environment and blah blah blah. No matter what benefits they had, she still hated meetings. The doodles started to get more and more nonsensical as the time went on. Her father sat down and gave the stage to a portly man, Jeff Wall, a solid middle manager with a voice that could double as anesthesia. As he tried to find his presentation on his laptop, Allie gave her phone a surreptitious glance. One new email. Her heart nearly stopped. Ben had finally written back. It had been almost a month since she'd heard from him. His messages before that had been short and clipped like you would send an overly eager work colleague, not one of his oldest friends. She itched to open the message and see what he'd written, but she couldn't. Not paying attention, especially as the boss's daughter wouldn't look right in a company-wide meeting. When Jeff finally got his presentation up on the projector, she decided to try and pay attention to it. Maybe actually participating would help the time go faster. It was no use. He was the most boring man at the company. Allie's mind wandered back to the email and what could possibly be in it. Hopefully an apology for being out of touch for that long. She let herself drift back to that night 10 years ago when they said goodbye. She'd known that there was a probability that he wouldn't stay forever. A teenage boy from a rival pack wanting to join them? Everyone's mind had gone straight to spy. But she knew better. He was just a lost soul and he was completely harmless. They'd become fast friends, and then more than that. When she had to say goodbye to him, it felt like losing a part of herself. He held her as she cried all over his shirt, and made him promise to keep in touch. It was like a teen movie cliché, and she half expected him to never talk to her again, but he'd replied to her texts and her emails with gusto at first, and then less and less as the time went on. But at least they talked still. It was nice having a friend detached from the hoopla surrounding her family and their position in the village and the property company they ran. He just knew her as Allie, not as Alexandra Galkin, daughter of Andre, the pack elder, not as the hotshot junior executive of a large property firm in upstate New York. She pulled herself back to the meeting. She hadn't missed much. Jeff was trying to explain a series of chart and graphs that only accountants would find interesting. Everyone else just looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. She knew the feeling. She straightened herself up to look like she was paying attention. The phone was so close yet so far. One touch of a button and she could read Ben's message. He made her feel like a teenage girl. It was the weirdest thing in the world. In real life she was a self-assured, confident executive. But the minute a little icon hit her phone she turned 18 again, waiting for the boy she loved to tell her something sweet or something about his day, or something made her feel equal parts young and happy and completely stupid. Grown women weren't supposed to be pining over boys they'd met for 3 months when they were teenagers and then never saw again. She pulled her attention back to the meeting. Jeff had finally finished his presentation and sat down. Thankfully he was the last presenter on the agenda, so they were in the home stretch. Listening to some is better than listening to none, Allie thought and looked up at the front of the room. Her father was next up to talk again. He was a tall man commanding even in his 50s. "All right everyone," he said. "Thank you for coming and I hope you got something useful out of this meeting." He swept his eyes over everyone in the room and nodded. Allie smiled. It was a trick he'd taught her when she first came to work for him. It made everyone feel appreciated on a personal level without actually having to put in that much effort. Let's get back to work. Thank goodness it's over, Allie thought to herself. No matter how much paperwork she had to do, her office was always a preferable alternative to having to sit in a hot, crowded conference room. But her seat was near the back of the conference room, so she had to wait for people to exit ahead of her. She took advantage of the time to open the email from Ben. "Hey Allie, I'm so glad you wrote. I've been thinking about you. I'm so happy to hear from you. It's been so long. I missed you so much too." It made her smile. Pathetic, she thought. It's a normal email, not a love letter. Pull yourself together. Not a moment too soon either, because her father was waiting in the corner of the room for her. He had that look on his face she knew so well. It was time for a father-daughter pep talk, as he called them, otherwise known as a rundown of the ways in which she was failing at the company. Once everyone had filtered out of the room, Andre signaled to his daughter to stay seated and close the conference room door. "Alexandra, we should discuss some things privately," he said. Allie huffed quietly and waited for him to speak first. He came over to her slowly and sat down in the chair across from her. He looked her up and down. Another trick he'd taught her, so she stared back and waited for him to say something. "How do you think you have been doing this past year?" he asked. A performance review? She was confused. They'd done one of these 6 months ago, and he had been more brutal on her than on any of the other employees he was evaluating. "I think I've been doing fine," she replied. "My division has consistently gone above and beyond the targets you set for us, and everyone works efficiently and gets along. You should know that by now, Father." Andre leaned back in his chair and smiled at her. "I didn't mean your division," he replied. "I meant you, Alexandra." He refused to use the shortened version of her name, insisting that if he had wanted to call her Allie, he would have named her that in the first place. "I don't understand. I'm asking if you think you are meeting your full potential here at the company in the position you are in now," Andre clarified. Allie didn't know how to answer the question. To be honest, she didn't actually know what her potential was. All her life she'd done what her father guided her towards. She was nothing if not a dutiful daughter. Her choice of colleges, classes, and even extracurriculars had been selected with Andre by her side. She fit perfectly into the mold of a life that her family had provided for her. She hesitated and then answered, "Yeah, I think I am." Andre leaned forward on the desk towards her. "I disagree," he said. He looked at her over the top of his fashionable rectangular glasses. "I think you have a lot more to give the company and the pack, to be honest." Allie almost rolled her eyes, a holdover from her younger years. The pack was above everything else. Andre had drilled that into her head from her childhood. Loyalty to the pack and loyalty to family was the most important thing. And then Ivan Volkov had become the pack alpha. That man radiated craziness that anyone with eyes could see from a mile away. And then Ben came along, and everything Allie thought she knew about loyalty and family and love went flying out the window. Still, she couldn't feel out what her father was trying to tell her. He caught on to her confusion. You have the potential to be a great leader, Alexandra, he said. But I see you holding yourself back. I don't hold myself back, she rebutted. Yes, you do. You turned down the last 2 promotions I offered you. Because I thought other people deserved them more than I did, Allie replied. That was almost the whole truth. There were people at the firm who had been there for longer than she had and who were in line for promotions. But more than that, at this point in her life, Allie started to feel the tightening of the net. She'd read that phrase in a book once, although she couldn't remember for the life of her what book it had been. The net around her life was starting to get tighter, and soon enough she wouldn't be able to escape. It was her own fault. Ben had told her as much once. You shouldn't let him have that much control over your life, he had written to her. You get one go at this life thing, Allie, and you don't get to redo the stuff that he ruins for you. You're right, she had replied. And he was. She knew that. Just wasn't that easy to put words into practice. Back in the present, Andre was still speaking to her. Alexandra, you need to start thinking about where you want your life to go. This isn't a game. If you don't stick to a disciplined path and actually see what you have to offer the world, you will be wasting a chance so many others would kill for. Not a new lecture from her father, but it still stung. 2 things in the world made her feel like less than the grown-up, capable woman she was. A message from Ben and a dressing down from her father. I get what you're saying, father, she replied. But right now I'm happy where I am. And isn't that the only thing that matters? She knew the answer to the question, and she smiled to herself when it came. Exactly as she predicted. There are many more things in this world more important than happiness, Alexandra, Andre replied. He stood up and she followed suit. Now let's not argue, he continued and motioned for her to follow him out of the room. Classic Allie Galkin code for stop talking back. And accept that I'm right. Allie gathered up her things and followed him. Father or not, he was still her boss. And she was a very good employee. Andre led her to his office. There were 3 people sitting in the waiting room in the antechamber of the CEO's office. He ignored all of them as he marched his daughter into the office and closed the door behind them. The office itself was almost twice as big as the waiting room cum antechamber. Outside it, floor-to-ceiling windows made up 2 of the walls. The rest of the walls were made up of dark and light wood, balanced to maximize light in the office even in the evenings. Expensive furnishings made it look like a room out of an architectural magazine. It was an office fit for a prince, and Andre felt he deserved every inch of it. When the building had first been completed, he'd brought Allie there to show her around. She had been about 10 years old, and she'd already known that most of the rest of her life had been determined by the man standing towering over her as she looked out the window at the impressive view. Buildings and trees wove together to create a vista that took little Allie's breath away. If you work really hard and you're a good girl, all this might be yours someday, Andre had told her. Allie still remembered the confusion she felt at the strange wording of his statement, but even then she knew that she should let the moment pass. Present-day Allie was still awestruck by the view out the window, so she took a minute to admire it before Andre would finally tell her what he wanted to tell her. When he still didn't speak, she cleared her throat and said, I have to get back to work, father. What's going on? Alexandra, I've told you many times that you shouldn't be so impatient, Andre said. There are many things you and I need to talk about. He smiled. The most paternal smile he could muster, which still wasn't that great, but Allie didn't really miss what she never had. Alexandra, he started. She really hated it when he used that tone. You've been more distracted around here for the past few months. It isn't good for morale to have an executive who is constantly on their phone, even in meetings. He sat down in the large leather chair behind the desk. Allie let herself have a little eye roll. If I'm on my phone, it's because clients have sent me emails, father, she explained. It's the age of instant communication. People don't want to wait for responses anymore. If I didn't answer, it would be bad for client relations. Andre looked unconvinced. Sit down, Alexandra, he said. When he repeated her name like that, it was usually a sign that he was about to push something or other onto her. She sat heavily in the guest chair opposite her father, trying to keep a hold on her impatience. There was no use in dismissing something she hadn't heard yet. She knew that. I would like you to reconsider your position on taking the promotion to my deputy. There it was. It was the position she had been groomed for since birth, to eventually take over the business and then marry someone who could help her run the company and produce acceptable grandchildren for Andre and her mother. Seniority be damned, he was going to put her in the job. She'd managed to avoid it so far, but Andre had begun pushing even harder of late. Andre noticed her hesitation. Whatever else he may have been, he was attentive to his daughter. The two of them could read each other like books. Listen, I understand that you are hesitant because you think it's nepotism, and you're not the most senior person here, he said. But I built this company with my own 2 hands from nothing, and when I'm gone I want it to go to someone who will care for it like only family can. Allie sighed. Father, I understand what you're saying, but what if I don't want to take over the company? It's a great job, but it's just a job for me. You know that. Andre's face darkened. She'd always been afraid of that look, of the anger that would come with it, but in the last few years she'd taught herself not to give in to it. She just looked back at him, trying to keep her face as neutral as possible. He frowned even deeper. All right, I want you to think about it, but for now we have other things to discuss. He pulled some files towards him on the desk. Andre was a very old-fashioned man in his business and in his family life. As one of the elders of the Sanguine Village pack, he was a big believer in tradition. He conducted his business that way too. Most things were done on paper in his office, with only unavoidable things being done on computers. He preferred paper reports and in-person updates to emails and text messages. He handed one to Allie. We have a new client. He is an old friend of the Volkov family. He recently came to New York from Europe and he will be staying here for a while. He has some projects he wants to do and I want you to manage the projects for him. Allie perused the file. In it were photos of some upscale, if generic-looking, buildings she'd never seen before. Those are his properties in Europe, Andre explained. Luxury housing complexes, office buildings, blocks of apartments. He had some contracts with governments to build low-income housing and things. She flipped through the pages until she got to a mock-up of what looked like a hotel marked simply New York. This is what he wants to build? She asked. Yes, it'll be a hotel of some sort. I think he wants to attach it to a convention center. Why do you need me to manage it? Someone from another department might be a better fit, she said. Andre smiled slightly. He is a very special client, Alexandra. He is very close friends with Nicholas. The penny dropped. Nicholas Vedinin was the alpha, the head of the Sanguine pack and a distant cousin of the Volkov family. When Crazy Ivan had been killed in the fight with Rex Blake, Nicholas took over the leadership. He was definitely a more stable man than Ivan had been, but he was cold, calculating, and unreadable. Andre had quickly become one of his most trusted advisors, and even though Allie would never say it out loud, one of Nicholas' most reliable yes-men. His enthusiasm for what seemed like such a small project made sense now. All right, fine, she said. I'll take it on. We need to set up a meeting, so if you could give my assistant his contact details, I'll get in touch with him. No need, said Andre. He and Nicholas are waiting for us outside right now. You can get to know each other. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone. Anna, please send the 2 gentlemen in, he said. Allie stood up from her chair to greet them. Nicholas led the way into the office. He was a tall man with fair hair that was starting to gray at the temples. Blue eyes and a wide smile rounded out the impression that he was a much friendlier man than he actually was. But his smile was a little too empty, the eyes a little too calculating. Allie had always been a little afraid of him, ever since the ceremony where he was given the position. Since That night, there had been rumors of wolves going missing, ones who had posed him in pact matters. Alexandra, Nicholas boomed, his smile as big as she had ever seen it. He gripped her hand in his, and her upper arm with his other hand. It's very good to see you again. You haven't been to many of the pack meetings lately. We missed you, he said. His grip was just a little too tight on her arm, but Alexandra didn't flinch. I know, I'm so sorry. I've just been completely swamped, she replied, smiling alternately at him and Andre. Well, I suppose your father is to blame for that, he said, laughing. Andre, you should let this young lady have some free time. She should be able to have a life, you know. One more squeeze of her arm and he let her go. Andre laughed slightly uncomfortably. You're right, Nicholas, you're right, he said. But she works so hard, I can't bear to tear her away. May I introduce you to my friend Darius? Nicholas said, turning to the man who had come in with him. Allie appraised him as he shook hands with her father. He was shorter than Andre and Nicholas both, but broader. He had pale skin, much paler than she considered healthy. His eyes were a watery blue color. His features seemed ill-fitting for his face, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what was wrong. He turned to greet her. How are you? He said as he shook her hand. His grip was tight, but his skin was clammy, and it turned Allie's stomach. Darius Antonov. She smiled awkwardly. Alexandra Galkin. For some reason she couldn't make herself give him the abbreviated version of her name. She tried to pull her hand away, but he lingered before finally letting her go. Please everyone have a seat, said Andre. Nicholas and Darius took the seats in front of the desk, so Allie made her way around to stand by her father. I've already briefed Alexandra about the project, Andre began. I believe all that is left now is for you, Mr. Antonov, to tell us all a little bit about your expectations for the project, and then Alexandra can take it from there. Very well, said Darius. Something about him made Allie very uncomfortable, and it wasn't helped by the strange tone in his voice. As I told your father, Miss Galkin, money is no object here. My company and I have unlimited funds for this project. It will be the first property I develop in the United States, so I want it to be completely perfect. It will be a hotel and conference center, but I want it to be the most modern and beautiful thing in the entire East Coast area. I myself will be traveling back and forth to Europe during the construction, so I expect regular updates from you on the progress and a quick resolution of any issues. Allie suppressed a shudder at the thought of working with the man. Something about him resembled nothing so strongly as a frog. She almost giggled out loud at the thought of the man's tongue darting out to catch a fly right in the middle of the meeting. That's fine, Mr. Antonov, that shouldn't be a problem, she said. He looked slightly smug. I will have my assistant draw up a tentative schedule, and then we can begin fine-tuning the details with the construction people next week. That should be fine, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. This is my contact information, he said. Please call me anytime, day or night. That did it. She couldn't suppress the shudder any longer. She reached for the card and took it by the edge to avoid having to touch the man. Something about him was so completely wrong, and she had never distrusted her gut before. She nodded at the three men in turn and said, Please excuse me, I have to get back to work. Her father nodded and stood from his chair. Nicholas and Darius followed suit. Old-fashioned to the core her father was. She gathered her things and walked out as fast as she could. There was something completely wrong with that man, she knew it. Nothing had actually happened to make her so certain, but she knew that if she didn't have a chance to talk to someone about it, it would eat her up inside. She fished her phone out from underneath the pile of papers and notebooks in her hands and dialed the number she had committed to memory at the age of 16. Naomi Grimes had been her best friend since sophomore year of high school. A transfer from one of the packs on the West Coast, Naomi had moved to Sanguine with her parents after some unpleasantness on her coast that she never talked about. They'd become great friends, and when Allie met Ben, Naomi had been the first person she told. You're being stupid, you know, she said as she had helped Allie sneak Ben into the house without Andre knowing. I mean, I'm here with you till the end, but I want it on the record that this is just a really dumb thing to do. Allie had rolled her eyes at the time, but she knew that Naomi meant no harm. She had been there for Allie through everything with Ben and her parents, and Allie trusted her completely. "Hey ALS," said Naomi when she answered the phone. "Hey Naomi," said Allie. "Are you free tonight? I want to talk." "Yeah, sure lady," replied Naomi. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just something weird happened with my dad and I feel like I need to power wash my soul from seeing our new client." She made a noise of disgust. And Naomi laughed. "All right. My shift at the hospital will be done at like 8 this evening, so I can come over, we'll have some wine and talk everything through." Allie heaved a breath. "Thank you so much," she said. "Tell all the cute doctors hi for me." "But you already said hi to me yourself," quipped Naomi. "I'll see you later." Allie smiled to herself as she rearranged the load on her arms and pushed open the door to her office with her hip. "Carrie," she called to her assistant. The wide-eyed young lady jumped up from her desk to take the stuff out of Allie's arms. "How was the meeting, boss?" she asked. Carrie had only been with Allie for a few months, but she was efficient and eager to please. "It was fine, thanks," Allie replied. Her office was a miniature version of her father's, with her assistant sitting in an anteroom which led to the main office. Allie settled into her chair and powered up her computer. First order of business was to figure out who this Darius Antonov was. The way her father and Nicholas were acting around him made her supremely uncomfortable. Their body language had changed around him. Andre was more on edge than he normally was, and Nicholas, always a block of overconfident ice, smelled like he was preparing for a fight. Allie's instincts were better than most people's. Most wolves were that way by nature, but she was more astute than others. And this guy didn't feel like good news. None of the searches she did brought up any suspicious hits. There were plenty of articles about the hotels and housing complexes he built and the charities he donated to, with photos of him in hard hats and expensive suits and with impossibly glamorous women on his arm, but nothing that would even raise an eyebrow to anyone else. Allie sat back. "Don't jump to conclusions," she thought to herself. She flipped through the file her father had given her on Antonov's project and started making notes. If she couldn't figure out what was wrong with the guy, the least she could do was make her father's company look good. The rest of the day went by as slowly as ever. Allie managed to get a good amount of work done, so when she dismissed Carrie to go home for the weekend, she didn't feel too badly about going home herself. The drive home was quiet and relaxing. She let herself completely forget about the unsettled feeling that Antonov had given her, the pressure from her father, and the unbearably long day she'd just been through. Her house was the one concession she'd managed to extract from her father. It was on the edge of the village, nestled in a sleepy little neighborhood of retired people and young families. It was nice. She'd decorated it exactly the way she wanted it, instead of taking suggestions from her image-conscious mother. It was all poofy cushions and comfortable couches and not a coordinated color in the bunch. It was comfortable, exactly the way she liked. She pulled into the tree-shaded driveway and dragged herself out of the car. All of a sudden her energy was completely gone, and it was all she could do to unlock the door and walk through it. She kicked her shoes off and dropped her purse and her coat on the table by the door. She then wandered into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, and took it into the living room. She collapsed on the couch and took a deep drink. It was the end of the week, and for the next 2 nights she could sleep as long as she wanted. The thought cheered her up a little and she let herself doze off on the couch. No more meetings for another week, thank God, was her last thought before she fell asleep. She woke up with a cloudy head and a dry mouth to a loud knocking on the door. Naomi's voice called out, "Hey, I see your car outside. Open the door or you're a terrible hostess." Allie jumped to her feet and stumbled to the door. "I'm so sorry," she said as she opened it. "I fell asleep, and I totally forgot I called you." Naomi grinned wickedly and helped up an abnormally large bottle of tequila. "Don't worry about it. We'll work out all your issues with this bad boy." She pushed past Allie and plopped down on the couch. "So what's dear old Pop's been up to this time?" Naomi asked as she opened the bottle. Allie brought her some glasses. Same old, same old. They clinked glasses before draining the generous amount of tequila Naomi had poured for both of them. "I was thinking on the way here," said Naomi. "Isn't that dangerous?" asked Allie. She had to dodge a pillow thrown by Naomi for that comment. I'm a great friend, so I'll ignore that, Naomi said. Anyway, I know exactly what you need tonight. We've talked this whole thing to death, ALS, and now we need to take your mind off it. What are you talking about? Asked Allie. I'm talking about getting dressed up and going out and having a drink with your best friend. Allie groaned. Come on, Nay, you can't expect me to go out on a Friday night. I'm exhausted. Naomi stood from the couch and stretched her hand to her friend. Yes, I can, and you're coming with me. You need some fun in your life, ALS. I'm just making sure you get it. Allie stuck her tongue out at her friend but took her hand all the same. Might be nice to have. Chapter 3. The next morning, Ben awoke to a mouth that felt like dry garbage and a numb left arm. He tried to move it, but something was weighing him down. He gingerly levered himself up and onto his side, careful not to jolt his head too much. There was a girl lying on his arm. Her hair was over her face, so he couldn't actually see who she was. He tried to remember what happened in the bar the other night, but the pounding in his temples was getting in the way of even seeing straight. He let his head fall against the pillow again and closed his eyes. Whatever time in the day it was way too early to be awake. The curtains were blocking out the worst of the sunlight, so that was something. After what felt like another eternity, he finally got up the strength to roll the woman off his arm. He pushed her off a little harder than he should have. She grunted a little but didn't wake up. He still had no idea who she was. The whole night before was a blur. After Pete had come to pick him up, they'd headed to their favorite bar, a place called Flame, somewhere in the city. The liquor had been flowing like war. The women were plentiful and eager. Friday night in Manhattan was prime time for meaningless sex, as he'd found out over the last 10 years. Pete, always the gregarious playboy, had quickly found a place for the two of them and a gaggle of women out celebrating something or other, one of their birthdays or something. Once the last of the champagne had been drunk, and Pete had headed home in a cab with two of the girls, Ben had been left alone, drinking the day away. The other girls in the group had slowly wandered away. When Ben made it clear he wasn't looking for any kind of companionship that night, so he sat at the bar alone and drank what seemed like the entire bar. At some point between the last glass of gin and tonic and a cab ride he couldn't remember, he made a call to one of the girls in his phone. He could barely remember the sex if he was completely honest with himself. The only thing he knew was that it had put him to sleep. Least he could be grateful that he'd gotten some rest. He still couldn't remember the last time he'd slept like that without some kind of chemical or female assistance. He tried to make himself focus on the things in the room, but his throat was so dry it hurt. There was a cup on his side table. It had only some water in it from last night, but it was better than nothing. He downed the whole thing in one gulp and grimaced before he slowly levered himself up. The woman stirred and turned to face him. Cheryl? What was her name? Hey, she said, groggy from the evening before. Very cliché, but Ben let it pass. How's it going? He said. She looked upset, but he didn't have the brain power to care about that now. Sherry, right? She looked even more upset about that comment. It's Cheryl, actually. She tossed the covers off and started searching around the floor for her clothes. Ah, Cheryl. His eyes had unblurred enough for him to recognize her as one of his previous bar conquests. They'd only hung out a couple of times before this, each time about 2 or 3 months apart. But still, he shouldn't have forgotten her name. That was a douche move. Ben sighed deeply. As much as he hated to make his brain work much more than it already was, he didn't want to hurt someone. Hey, I'm sorry, he said. I'm just really hungover. My brain and my mouth are not working together at the moment. Can I offer you some coffee? Cheryl was not having it, though. She scoffed and kept looking for pieces of her outfit. She had already pulled on her underwear and her bra, and she put on her dress as she was looking for her shoes. It's fine. Whatever. She tossed over her shoulder. She stepped into her shoes and grabbed her purse from near the bedroom door. Do me a favor, Ben, she said. Don't call me next time you're lonely and feeling bad for yourself. She stormed out of the bedroom. Then he heard the front door slam closed behind her. He looked at his phone and groaned. Only an hour before opening time. He hauled himself out of bed and debated opening the curtains, but decided against it. The last time he decided to be a hero and open the curtains in the middle of a hangover, he almost died. So this time he just kept to the darker parts of the already dark room and stumbled to the shower. By the time he'd showered and dressed and swallowed a handful of Advil, the headache had faded to a dull throb. He grabbed his keys as he looked at his watch. He wouldn't have time to have breakfast before opening time, so coffee and a bagel in the office it was. He made it to the store in record time and made himself a cup of coffee before he started doing all the little things he needed to before opening. Tyler was late, of course, although he couldn't blame a teenager for wanting to sleep in. On a Saturday morning, Ben went around and opened the shutters on the outside of the store, then put up the displays that needed to be redone. He was in the middle of putting a stray cart back in the corral when his phone went off. Was Pete. "Good morning, Pete," he said, a little louder than he really needed to. "There is absolutely no need to yell, man," Pete replied. His voice sounded as rough as Ben's. "I just wanted to make sure you got home all right. You didn't look good last night." "Thanks. I'm fine. A little flattered that you thought about calling when you just spent the night with 2 girls." Pete laughed and then groaned. "More details to follow. Glad you're alive. Gotta go die." He got off the line and Ben laughed to himself. The caffeine was definitely helping him cope with what was left of the hangover. He went inside and flipped the sign he kept on the door to open and waited for the weekend rush. The yoga pants wearing housewives and their terribly behaved children would be descending on the store to stock up on whatever they needed for their inane lives, and he would need some caffeine fortification before that happened. 2 more cups of coffee later, the first of the customers started to trickle in. Luckily, the first wave didn't come in with rowdy children. The day went by as normal, checking out people ranging from the completely apathetic to the openly disdainful, but that was par for the course. When the store was empty, and Ben was in the middle of replacing some cans that a child had knocked off a shelf, Ben suddenly realized that he hadn't checked his phone for a message from Allie in almost 12 hours. That was something to be proud of, right? He smiled to himself as he finished up with the cans and stood up. He grunted as he got up. 28 and an old man already, he thought. He felt himself reaching for his pocket but consciously made himself stop. No good would come from letting himself slip back into a state of being in love with a girl he hadn't seen in 10 years. Last time he let his control slip, he'd almost drunk himself to death. Allie had told him one day that she was seeing someone, one of the guys that came through her father's company, a client or something, and it hit him so hard he'd completely stopped replying to her messages for 3 months. She'd almost blown up his phone by the end of it, worried out of her head. He wouldn't let himself get like that ever again. She was a person from his past. Someone who could only be a friend if she was anything at all. He headed up to the till. Tyler might have been a teenager, but he was more than capable of dealing with the stocking and cleaning by himself, so Ben would cover the checkout and try not to look at his phone for the next hour or so. He'd just gotten up behind the cash register when Rex Blake, the alpha of the Fell Pack, strolled in with Alan Green, his advisor and pack elder, and Rex's daughter Eve. Ben smiled. She was one of the better-behaved children in the village, probably because of her father's status as pack leader. She always said please and thank you, and Ben rewarded her with a piece of candy whenever her parents agreed. Eve saw him and ran up to the till. "Hi, Ben," she said, waving. 10 was a good age, Ben thought. Kids that age were a lot cooler than he would have thought. Really curious about the world, but able to hold a conversation with someone. "Hey, little dude," Ben greeted her. He reached down for a high five, which she happily gave. "Got anything new in the book section?" she asked. "I don't know. You should go check it out," he replied. She was as voracious a reader as her parents were, so her first stop in the store was the admittedly limited book section. Rex smiled at his daughter as she walked to the book section, trying not to look like she was in too much of a rush. Apparently, rushing to things you enjoy was now not considered cool among teenagers. "Good morning," Rex said as he reached up over the register and shook Ben's hand. In the 10 years since the incident with Ivan in the forest, Rex had it pretty well. His once dark hair was now starting to go salt and peppery. At the temples, there was the faintest suggestion of a scar on his forehead. From the fight, legend had it that Rex had taken on almost 10 people single-handedly in the forest before he finally killed Ivan. It had taken a good 7 years after the incident for Rex to finally tell Ben some of what had happened that night. about how Ivan had decided that poaching members of the Fell Pack wasn't enough, about how he'd kidnapped Rex's wife who had been pregnant with Eve. But still, despite being the one person in the village who had good reason to be upset with Ben for leaving the pack, Rex had been nothing but helpful and kind, even going so far as to threaten punishment for anyone who tried to ostracize the James family from village life. "Ben, good morning," said Alan. He was a little less spry than he had been 10 years ago, but Alan still commanded respect everywhere he went in the village. Tradition was important to werewolves, even though some had managed to adapt to modern life more than others. An irrational thrill of fear started in the recesses of Ben's mind. He quashed it. There would be no thinking of the reason his relationship with Allie was so difficult. "How are you, Alan?" he replied. "Is there anything I can help you find?" "No, thank you," Alan replied. "We just need to pick up a few things. Someone is having a birthday party this weekend." Eve smiled at him, rolling her eyes slightly. "He's trying to say it's Mom's birthday." Felicity, Rex's wife, wasn't a werewolf. No one really knew the whole story behind how Rex and Felicity had met, but she had quickly become a fixture in the village. Of course, as with anything in a small town, rumors abounded. One of the more ridiculous ones was that Felicity was in witness protection. Whatever the reason that she was in Fell, she was a welcome addition to a pack. That didn't really get much new blood. "That's really nice," Ben replied as he took the little pile of books that Eve had brought with her. She was a kid with an eclectic taste, so she'd chosen 2 graphic novels, a detective novel and one from some series for kids. "Make sure you tell her happy birthday for me." Rex came up behind his daughter with a basket full of various party odds and ends and started unloading them next to Eve's books. "So how's life treating you, Ben?" he asked. "Business going well? Because you look kind of terrible." "Yeah, everything's going okay. My old man won't stop calling every day to make sure I haven't burned the place down, but everything other than that is going great," Ben replied. He ignored the last part of the question. Rex didn't say anything about the avoidance and laughed. "Yeah, your dad was always a hard kind of a guy, wasn't he? I remember him from when we were kids, yelling at us to stop setting fireworks off in empty parking lots. To be fair, he owned the parking lot, but still." Ben chuckled along. "That's my dad. Still the same. The heart attack never even slowed him down." "How are they doing these days?" "Well, Dad is Dad. Mom is still puttering around the house. She's just happy that I've taken over the store." Rex smiled. He waited until Ben had finished ringing up the total for their purchases to hit him with the next question. "I have something I need to talk to you about," he said. "Felicity's party is going to be tomorrow, so you should come by and we'll have a good talk." Ben suddenly felt apprehensive. "Sure, that would be fine," he said. "But if it's something serious, do you want to talk about it now?" "No, I don't want to spoil the surprise. Just make sure you come to the party tomorrow," Rex said. Ben grimaced but agreed. "I'll be there around 2. He handed Rex his bags. "Over the counter. By Evie, by Alan," he said as they left. Rex had always been nice to him, probably because he thought Ben was just a mixed-up kid he could straighten out, but they hadn't ever had any talks that weren't of the motivational sort. He had no idea what his talk with Rex tomorrow could be about. Before he could begin to puzzle it out, Alan bustled back into the store. "Sorry, we forgot a couple of things," he said. Ben came out from behind the till to help. "What can I get for you?" Alan rubbed a hand over his gray hair. "We need some seltzer and a couple more bottles of soda." Ben hurried to get them for him. As much as Alan tried to keep up with his previous routine, he was starting to slow down. That much was evident. "By the way, did Rex tell you about the party tomorrow?" "Yes, he did." "Good. I hope we'll be seeing you there," Alan said. Ben carried the bags to the door for him and held it open. "You're in on this, too," Alan replied. "Who do you think gave him the idea, boy?" His eyes twinkled, and Ben felt a sudden rush of affection for this man who had given so much to the pack. The night before Ben's first full moon, Alan had gathered all the young people together in the diner and served them all some ice cream. "It'll be a long road, kids, but this is what our people are, and you must never forget that even if we are different, this is what makes us strong." The words had always stuck with Ben, but the gesture had meant even more. "So, Whenever Alan came in over the years, he tried to give him a little bit of a special treatment, the occasional item on the house, carrying his bags out to the car, things like that. He escorted Alan to Rex's waiting car and passed the bag to him before they drove off. If they didn't want to tell him what they were up to, there wasn't much he could do about it. The hour time limit he had set for himself passed pretty quickly. It helped that there were more customers in the store than he'd had all week. The weather was getting warmer, so people were probably getting ready for cookouts and barbecues and pool parties and things, as the 1 hour he'd already been here stretched into 2 and then into 3. He couldn't help but to wish everyone would just get the hell out of his store. Finally, when the customers slowed to a trickle, he decided that it was about time Tyler got some proper hands-on experience with the till and called him up. "Just be careful when you scan, and if you get into trouble, page me," Ben said. He practically ran to his office to check his emails. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the one message. "Hey Benny," she wrote. "It was really nice to hear from you. Although I don't actually know why you're being so formal. Chill. We're friends, right? I think. So anyway, you disappeared on me. You need to stop doing that. Everything is good with me. We just got a new client at work and I feel like something is really wrong with the guy. Have you ever had that kind of feeling? Right back. Soon, okay? I miss having a surly, grumpy sounding board." Ben smiled to himself. There she was. The Allie he knew. She'd always had a funny way of expressing herself, and he could just imagine her rambling the same thing to him if they were in the same place. As much as he tried to distract himself from thinking about her, she was an always present part of his psyche. He cracked his knuckles as he thought of the right way to respond to Allie's email. Then it clicked. He wouldn't email her. He'd text her. She hadn't changed her number since she first got a phone, and they'd texted back and forth for a while, but when she started to think her father might start to go through her phone, they switched to email and then other messaging apps. But they were now at an age where he suspected Allie's father would no longer have any say over her phone. "Hey Al, it's me. Just got your message. I'm not surly or grumpy, just FYI." He texted, and then he waited. The response didn't take nearly as long as he thought it might. "You are," she wrote. Short and sweet. "You're wrong. Anyway, what did you need to bounce off me? Creepy guy at work. No biggie. The guy just gives me a really bad vibe for some reason." He frowned. Her instincts about people were almost never wrong, even though other people often sold her short. "What's going on? Who is this guy anyway? My dad brought in his business, and now I have to oversee his project. He's like stupid rich, but he also kind of looks like a cartoon frog. Just not as cute." Ben laughed to himself. You shouldn't have to be around someone who makes you uncomfortable, though. "What did your dad say?" "I haven't said anything to him. He's not the kind of person you tell this to." Just as he was starting to type out the next message, there was a knock at the door. Tyler poked his head around the corner. "Your dad is here," he said with no preamble, and then disappeared again. Ben rolled his eyes. "Thanks, Tyler," he called. His father being in the store wouldn't be about anything good. The last time he'd come in, he'd berated Ben about changing the door alarm from the bell that used to hang over it. Ben was sure that he was going to be in top form today. "I have to talk to my dad for a minute, but I will think of something for you to tell your dad." He typed as quickly as he could. He made himself stand as straight as he could and walked out the door. Slouching was unacceptable in the James household, and the habit had stuck for the most part, but in the grips of a hangover it was easy to let it slip. His muscles nearly screamed in protest as he walked out into the main store. Ron James was standing by the till. The heart attack hadn't changed him much. He still held himself like a wrestler, wide stance and arms usually curled into fists at his side. His face was usually passive, verging on a frown. Ben could count the number of times that he had seen Ron smile on his fingers. "Hey Dad," he said. "Nice to see you." Ron grunted and nodded at his son. "There was some trouble around the edge of town. Thought you might know something." "Well, I don't know about every incident around the edge of town," he said. His father's comment put him on edge, and he could feel the heat starting to well up behind his eyes. He breathed deeply and came around the till, putting the cash register between Ron and himself. "Do you want to go talk in the office, Dad? You might be more comfortable." Sitting down, said Ben. Ron just grunted in response. Being treated like a guest in the store he had found it was not something he had ever been able to come to terms with. Instead, he just rested an elbow on the counter and settled himself squarely on his feet. Ben tried to stop himself from rolling his eyes again. What did you come to talk to me about, Dad? He asked. Just that there's been some trouble out on the edge of town. What kind of trouble? Ben asked. Word has it that some of the wolves in the Sanguine village have been brawling with each other. And humans once or twice, Ron replied. You haven't heard anything about it, have you? You already asked, Dad, and I already said no, Ben huffed. Ron cleared his throat, and the noise set Ben's teeth on edge. He tried to keep his temper under control. So how's everything with the business? Ron asked. It's going fine. Checking up on the business was Ron's favorite way to keep tabs on his son. Are you keeping on top of everything? The books and the stock? Asked Ron. Yes, I am. You also signed the store over to me years ago, so I don't really understand why you're asking, Ben replied. Whenever he talked to his father, he found himself on the defensive. It had been that way ever since he was a kid. Ron James was an old-fashioned father. He didn't believe in showing affection or pride of any kind to his son, instead choosing to spend his time outside his store, sitting in his recliner in the den, talking only to Dolores. Ben was only good for toting around his father's beers or mowing the lawn. On occasion, he would also be a good target for this father's rages. Thankfully, he never aimed them at Dolores. The day he ran away 10 years ago, Ben had given Ron the chance to talk him out of it. The guidance counselor at school was always going on and on about how important it was to communicate the things you want clearly and confidently. Ben had always thought it was a bunch of hippie nonsense, but some part of him wanted to know that his father would care if he were gone. That afternoon he'd come home from school and finished his chores as soon as he could. Dolores was out with some of her friends from the village, so it would just be Ron and Ben for the night. Dad, can I talk to you about something? Ben had asked when Ron came home from work. Ron just grunted, grabbed a beer, and rolled on into the den. He didn't look back at his son as he went. That was the moment Ben decided that he wouldn't stay home. He'd packed a bug-out bag that had sat on the floor of his closet for the last 3 months, just in case Ron decided to make good on his threat to kick Ben out the minute he turned 18. So that night he got his bag, climbed out the window, and disappeared for 3 months. Present-day Ben brought his attention back to his father, who had started to talk about the weather and the next full moon and how this new crop of pups was the worst thing to happen to the village and local politics and a bunch of other things that old people seemed to find to fill up their time when they were retired. And anyway, I heard from someone in the next village that the Sanguine Alpha is starting to make noises about territory again, reshuffling his hierarchy. Apparently, all thanks to that one guy called Galkin, I heard, said Ron. Ben froze. Galkin, as in Andre Galkin? Of course, Andre Galkin. Rumor has it that Veteran is moving him up in the pack. Maybe you should have made good with him when you had the chance. Ron laughed, phlegm and throaty and rough, and at that moment Ben hated him a little bit. Well, thanks for stopping by, Dad. Was there something you needed to pick up? Ron looked around the store casually, unbothered. I don't think so, but I could use a little extra toilet paper. You know your mother. She panics when things are even half gone. Ben brought a package of rolls up for his father and bagged it. He'd ring them up and pay later. Ron didn't subscribe to the notion that people needed to pay for things in their own store, so not letting him know was probably a good idea. Ron picked up the bag and looked Ben up and down. You look like shit, he said. I love you too, Dad, Ben said, smiling as he held the door open for his father. Ron huffed at Ben and shuffled out the door. As Ben walked back to the office, he thought of what he was going to write. Back to Allie. Talk to your father, he'd say. Stand up for yourself. In fact, he told her exactly that, the countless times that he'd held her in his arms as she cried over Andre pushing her into a life she didn't want. Hell, he told her that not 20 minutes ago. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. Look, ALS, he typed. Fathers suck. Most of them really suck. But you can't let the man push you into things you don't want. Her reply came instantly. 1. Did your father just come see you? 2. My father does suck. We established that fact 10 years ago. But he is still my boss. So, I can't do too much about it right this second. 3. Any creepy guy warding techniques? 'Cause seriously, the guy looks like a frog and he's really freaking me out. Ben laughed aloud at that. Creep warding techniques. If he had been there, he would have been the first one to try and defend her from the frogman. But Allie could handle herself. She'd matured in the last few years. Hold the line, soldier. I know you can do it, he typed back. Then he shoved the phone back into his pocket. Something was different from this morning. Might have been the coffee, it might have been the shovelfuls of Advil he'd taken to ward off the lingering effects of the hangover, but the sun shining. This bride didn't bother him so much. And then it hit him. It was Allie. It was Allie again. She was back under his skin, worming her way into the recesses of his mind, and interrupting his self-pitying funks with her relentless wit and humor, and he wasn't sure if he liked it. But maybe this time, if he was careful, she wouldn't be anything more than just a friend to him. He could make himself realize that being in love with a practical stranger, because after 10 years that is what she was, would lead him right back to the comfortable hidey hole he'd made for himself in the bowels of a whiskey bottle. She's just a friend, he repeated to himself. Just a friend. But still, he couldn't help himself responding on a completely primeval and visceral level to the thought of her. He could still recall the scent of her shampoo if he concentrated hard enough, could still feel how soft her skin was on his fingertips the night they'd spent together in an abandoned shed at the edge of Sanguine Village. He went back to the office and opened his email. There were messages from suppliers and customers to be answered, and then he had to do inventory. Those few hours would be a good time for him to figure out how to keep himself on the road away from falling in love with Alexandra Galkin again. He would probably also have to keep Tyler from breaking merchandise or himself. Ben smiled to himself. It was going to be a long, crazy, very great